Welcome back to independent.ie. I'm joined this afternoon by University College Cork political scientist Theresa Reidy, and we're going to talk this afternoon about spoiled votes. Just briefly explain what a spoiled vote is, Theresa.
A spoiled vote is where there isn't a clear preference on the ballot that indicates the intentions of the voters. But the bigger problem is where people actually go into the polling station. It's quite clear they actually want to express a preference, but they don't actually know how to vote.
There's a big problem with people putting X's, I think. Isn't that one of the situations
Yeah.
where you're supposed to count from one through your preferences down to whatever the number is?
We see particularly where there might be two candidates from a political party and they go in and they mark, say, X next to the two Fianna Fáil candidates or the two Fine Gael candidates. So we know that they did have a clear preference and they wanted to vote, but they just didn't know how to vote.
Let's look at Dublin. That's one of the constituencies that's come in now. Now we can see from this graph the number of spoiled votes in 2014 is hugely smaller than the number of spoiled votes that have occurred in this most recent European Parliament election. Can you explain why that might be?
So there are a couple of things going on here. First of all, we know that there are way more candidates on the ballots this time around in Dublin, but particularly in Ireland South, which has this 23 candidate ballot paper. So that makes it a little bit more complicated. So inadvertently people may vote the wrong way, they may miss a preference or something along those lines. We also know this time around that there's a lot of ballots coming through that are blank. So people took all of the ballots, but they actually didn't cast a preference. So that's also contributing to some of the confusion.
Let's move on to one of the more talked about ballot papers, and that's down there in Ireland South. Now this ballot paper is 2 foot long, people are saying. What are the drawbacks of having a ballot paper that long, Theresa?
So this is the ballot paper I used myself on Friday. There's an advantage for candidates that are at the top of the ballot. So the ballot is actually listed in the candidates by alphabetical order. So if you're at the top of the ballot paper, you have a better chance of picking up preferences than if you're at the bottom of the ballot paper. So this is something that happens in other countries, and the way they've dealt with it is they randomise your position on the ballot in different batches. But we've actually ended up with a ballot paper that's too long, it's unwieldy, and there's a bit of an inbuilt incentive now, or advantage, sorry, for people at the top of the ballot paper.
So say here in this ballot paper, Mick Wallace is down there with W as a second name, so that could be a disadvantage for him when it comes down to
it could disadvantage him. I mean, probably not in first preferences, because if you're voting for Mick Wallace, you're going to go in and find him. But if you're going to have preferences as you go along, you might not go all the way to the end.
You're just going to get bored by the end of it.
Absolutely, and we have to remember some of these races are actually very tight. 3 or 4 votes here and there kind of can change the outcome of an election.
Okay, votes are still going on around the country, but in the last hour or so, a few have come in for the mayoral elections, the plebiscites that have been in Limerick, Galway and Waterford, or Cork and Waterford. What are the results so far?
So far the plebiscite has been rejected in Waterford, it's been accepted in Limerick, and it's hanging on a knife edge in Cork. I think actually, just picking up on the spoiled ballots, one of the interesting things about this is a lot of voters actually handed back the mayoral plebiscites in their areas.
They just didn't want to vote.
Didn't know what it was, and they just didn't vote. They handed it back in the polling stations. And again, anecdotal evidence from the counts is telling us there's a lot of blank ballots in here. There was a really poor information campaign about this. Voters didn't know what they were. There was, it was very interesting. The Referendum Commission was doing all this excellent work on the divorce referendum, but it never mentioned how to vote in the local elections or the European Parliament elections or the plebiscites, because it doesn't actually have any powers for doing that. But it meant that it was a pretty strange situation where one ballot was getting some voter education and these other things were actually getting very little attention.
Thanks, Theresa. Join us later for more political analysis on independent.ie.